This is Politics UK. I'm Charlotte Wright. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, the government announces plans to speed up compensation for victims of the post office scandal.
This is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history.
It is a huge injustice. People lost their lives, their liberty and their livelihood.
Years after the scandal first came to light, the government gives details of how the victims will be exonerated and compensated.
An honest postmaster will have his or her conviction overturned, and just by signing one document can secure compensation.
We are all united in this House in wanting the sub-postmasters exonerated in full and for them to receive compensation with urgency.
Labour says ministers didn't do enough to prepare for recent flooding.
The government's failure to act effectively against the risk of floods has cost the economy billions of pounds.
The government held a Cobra Unit Cabinet Office meeting last Tuesday to promote cross-sector preparedness action way in advance of Storm Henk taking place.
And Scotland debates what to do about bully XL dogs as a ban on the breed approaches in England and Wales.
Ministers are urgently reviewing the policy on XL bully dogs, and public safety will be paramount in our deliberations.
The scandal over the sub-postmasters who were wrongly prosecuted by the Post Office has dominated the week. Many blameless people lost their jobs and some were sent to prison because the software they were using in their post offices made errors that made it look like money had been stolen. Sean, this has been known about for years, hasn't it? But it just gets bigger the more we learn about it.
Yes, MPs have been debating this for a long time. There have been lots of news reports about this. Just before MPs left Westminster for the Christmas break, almost the very last thing they discussed was this scandal. And during that debate, they mentioned that there was going to be a television drama about the affair, and that they were saying, well, we'll be looking forward to seeing what that is like and what impact it has. I don't think any of them could have expected the impact that that ITV drama, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, would have. Millions of people were suddenly made aware or reacquainted with this scandal, and it meant that when MPs and ministers returned to Westminster after the New Year break, they were under intense pressure to do something about the scandal. And so we saw within just the opening hours, really, of the parliamentary day, questions being asked and ministers being forced to make promises and commitments that they would do something. And then Prime Minister's questions, the big moment, I guess, in the parliamentary week, right at the start, we saw the Prime Minister himself making the big announcement.
This is one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history. People who worked hard to serve their communities had their lives and their reputations destroyed through absolutely no fault of their own. The victims must get justice and compensation. Sir Win Williams' inquiry is undertaking crucial work to expose what went wrong, and we've paid almost £150 million in compensation to over 2,500 victims. But today I can announce that we will introduce new primary legislation to make sure that those convicted as a result of the Horizon scandal are swiftly exonerated and compensated. We will also introduce a new upfront payment of £75,000 for the vital GLO group of postmasters. We will make sure that the truth comes to light, we right the wrongs of the past, and the victims get the justice they deserve.
It is a huge injustice. People lost their lives, their liberty and their livelihood, and they've been waiting far too long for the truth, for justice and for compensation. So I'm glad the Prime Minister is putting forward a proposal. We will look at the details, and I think it's the job of all of us to make sure that it delivers the justice that is so needed. Mr. Speaker, back in 2022, when Boris Johnson claimed he would send asylum seekers to Rwanda, one ambitious Tory MP had reservations. He agreed with Labour that it wouldn't work. It was a waste of money. It was the latest in a long line of gimmicks. Does the Prime Minister know what happened to that MP?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what that honourable gentleman refers to is a document that he hasn't seen, I haven't seen, and has been reported second-hand in a bunch of media newspapers. But what I can tell him is, I am absolutely clear that you do need to stop the boats, and that's what this government and that MP is going to deliver.
I notice he didn't deny it, Mr. Speaker. I'm not surprised. £400 million of taxpayer money down the drain. No one sent to Rwanda. Small boats still coming. It's hardly a surprise he wanted to scrap the scheme when he was trying to sneak in as Tory leader. But he's been caught red-handed opposing the very thing that he's now made his flagship policy. Which member should we listen to? The one before us today, or the one who used to believe in something?
Mr. Speaker, I've always been crystal clear. You do need to have an effective deterrence to finally solve this problem. In fact, the National Crime Agency agree that you need, in their words, an effective removals and deterrence agreement. And that's why, after becoming Prime Minister, I negotiated a new deal with Albania, thanks to which we have seen a 93% drop in illegal arrivals from Albania. That's how Australia stopped the boats. That's why Italy, Germany and Austria are all looking at similar schemes. He's the only one who's opposed to a proper deterrent. Not because it doesn't work, because he doesn't actually believe in controlling migration, Mr. Speaker. Every single time he picks the people smugglers over the British people.
Mr. Speaker, we should smash the gangs, process the claims and end hotel use. That's our plan. And unlike the Prime Minister, I believe in it. When's he going to stop pretending that up is down, that black is white, admit that whether it's the economy, immigration, the NHS, he has failed?
He talks about the backlog, 112,000 decisions made last year, a higher number than in any year in the past 2 decades, Mr. Speaker. He talked about hotels. Well, the first 50 are being closed and there are more to come, Mr. Speaker. He talks about the numbers. Well, they were down by over a third last year, Mr. Speaker, the first time that's happened. And then he talked, Mr. Speaker, he talked about smashing the gangs. Well, if he does care about smashing the gangs, why doesn't he own up to the fact that when it came to the Nationality and Borders Act, he blocked, delayed and voted against the powers in that act, which have allowed us to now arrest hundreds and hundreds of people connected with that illegal trade who have been sentenced to hundreds of years in prison.
Mr. Speaker, a horizon system introduced by Tony Blair, the former Labour Party leader and of course now a Knight's Garter, a horizon system defended by the current leader of the Liberal Democrats, himself a Knight bachelor, a horizon system scandal overseen by a former Conservative Prime Minister who now hides in the House of Lords as a baron. The reality is that sub-postmasters never stood a chance against the Westminster establishment, did they?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said, this is actually one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our country's history. And all our thoughts are with those who worked so hard for their communities and have seen their lives and reputations destroyed. And since this scandal, as the honourable gentleman pointed out, has actually unfolded over decades and with multiple people clearly at fault. But since 2019 in the High Court case, this government established a statutory inquiry led by Sir Wyn Williams to uncover what went wrong, established an independent advisory board and has established 3 different compensation schemes paying out £150 million to over 2,500 people, with now almost 2/3 having received final compensation. But we must go further and faster, Mr. Speaker, which is why we have made new announcements today.
So that was the Prime Minister there at Prime Minister's Questions talking about how the government is going to try to get justice for these sub-postmasters. But then straight after, we heard a little bit more detail about that, didn't we, from the minister responsible for the Post Office?
Yes. So Rishi Sunak had got the big moment, the spotlight, if you like, where he could say, here's what we're going to do, new announcement, but he didn't give very many more details. So it fell to Kevin Holland-Rake, who's been the minister dealing with all of this, to come along and give out more details. And essentially, and we got a hint of it there, Rishi Sunak saying, what the government's going to do, it is going to change the law. It's going to introduce a new law for England and Wales, which it will basically say will exonerate and clear the name of all of these hundreds of postmasters. And so Kevin Holland-Rake then sort of set out more details and then faced questions about what the government plans to do next.
The Horizon Compensation Advisory Board has recommended that we should overturn all the convictions of the postmasters who were prosecuted in the Horizon scandal. Following their recommendation would involve quite unprecedented action by Parliament to overturn specific verdicts of the courts. The government, of course, completely recognises the importance of an independent court system and judiciary. So this recommendation raises important issues of constitutional principle. This is therefore not a decision we can take lightly. It also creates the risks of a different sort of injustice. I'm sure that a great many people were wrongly convicted in this scandal, but I cannot tell the House that all of those prosecuted were indeed innocent. So we have been faced with a dilemma: either accept the present problem of many people carrying the unjustified slur of conviction, or accept that an unknown number of people who have genuinely stolen from their post office will be exonerated or perhaps even compensated. I can therefore announce that we intend to bring forward legislation as soon as we can to overturn the convictions of all those convicted in England or Wales on the basis of post office evidence given during the Horizon scandal. The government will, in the coming days, consider whether to include the small number of cases that have already been considered by the appeal courts and the convictions upheld. We recognise this is an exceptional step, but these are exceptional circumstances. So all we ask is that as part of their claims of compensation, postmasters sign a statement to the effect they did not commit the crimes of which they're accused. Anyone subsequently found to have signed such a statement untruthfully will be putting themselves at risk of prosecution or fraud. I do not pretend to the House that this is a foolproof device, but it is a proportionate one which respects the ordeal with which these people have already suffered. It means that an honest postmaster will have his or her conviction overturned, and just by signing one document can secure compensation.
We are all united in this House in wanting the sub-postmasters exonerated in full and for them to receive compensation with urgency. And I do think, Mr. Speaker, it's important to say exoneration and not a pardon, because a pardon does imply guilt that is then forgiven. We recognise doing so is not straightforward, and it may be imperfect. But this is an unprecedented scandal, and it will require an unprecedented response. And the alternatives of not acting I see as even less desirable. We therefore stand ready to work with the government to deliver a solution that achieves the long-awaited justice and compensation at pace. Can I thank the Minister for the ongoing conversations we've been having on this matter and ask him if he can guarantee that compensation payments will immediately follow any exonerations under the terms of the compensation schemes as they stand today. Could he indicate any sort of timescale for this? I know he appreciates that victims cannot continue to wait years for payments. Given what he has said about the implications of a blanket exoneration, we will need to consider what safeguards might be necessary as best as is possible to ensure public money does not flow into the pockets of those who are not entitled to it. And he mentioned the potential of a statement that people may be asked to sign. And I wonder if he could say if that will be drawn up in close consistency and work with the advisory committee. Mr. Speaker, as the sub-postmasters have repeatedly said, and it must surely be they who get the credit for these extraordinary measures, what matters now is getting compensation to people swiftly. And this whole House is united in its determination to deliver the justice, truth and compensation that has been denied and delayed time and time again.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank him for his response to my earlier remarks, and I appreciate his offer to work with us and to stand with us to deliver the compensation and the overturning of convictions. The first step will be, of course, legislation, and again, this is something we're very happy to work with him on. The legislation may take some weeks to deliver, but the sooner the better, and that will be a matter for the House, of both Houses, of course, in terms of the introduction and passing of that legislation. But our intention is to get on with that very, very quickly, of course. From that, it should be the case. It was a simple process, a statement that needs to be signed, as he refers to and I referred to earlier, and of course we'll work with the advisory board to make sure that statement is an appropriate one. The good news is, following the ITV dramatisation, we've seen a good number of new cases come to light. We are keen for that to happen, for people to come forward, whether they've suffered convictions or whether they've just suffered financial detriment through shortfalls, and we're keen to make sure those people get access to compensation as quickly as possible.
Okay, MPs in Westminster there discussing justice for the sub-postmasters. We'll come back to you in a bit, Sean. Thank you very much. But let's go to Edinburgh now and to our Scotland political correspondent, Andrew Kerr, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Andrew, the Scottish Government is also having to deal with the fallout from the Post Office scandal. And at First Minister's questions, the opposition parties demanded that Scotland's top law officer appear before the Scottish Parliament. Is that likely?
Well, Charlotte, it's interesting, isn't it? Because with our separate justice system here, our separate legal system here, it does make things just a little bit more complicated. Now, the First Minister, Hamza Yousaf, has suggested that the legislation for England and Wales be extended to cover Scotland, because here it was the Crown Office that prosecuted these cases and not the Post Office privately. So, of course, at First Minister's questions, the Conservatives demanded the Lord Advocate appear. Let's hear what they have to say.
The Crown Office in Scotland must be transparent. Prosecutors were aware of issues with the flawed Horizon system more than 10 years ago. So, First Minister, we don't need meetings or briefings from the Lord Advocate. We need her here in Parliament to answer questions about this scandal. Does the First Minister agree that the Lord Advocate should urgently come to this Parliament to answer questions?
First Minister. That the Lord Advocate, when she discharges her functions as head of the prosecution service, she does so independently of me. When I spoke to the Lord Advocate this morning, she was more than happy to consider whether it was a briefing, whether it was a ministerial statement, whatever was appropriate, she was willing to consider that. And I'm certain the Lord Advocate is listening to these exchanges. And of course, it will be for her to determine in her independent function as head of the prosecution service on terms of how she should answer any of those questions. Let me reiterate the point here that Scottish prosecutors were told in September 2013 to treat cases reported by the Post Office in regard to their facts and circumstances and evidence which did not rely upon Horizon. So they should be reported on their individual regard.
Now, the Scottish Labour leader also demanded the Lord Advocate appear before MSPs. We'll have to now wait to see if that happens. Anna Sarwar was also saying that Post Office investigators acted like a private police force and the mob. He wants the Lord Advocate to get Police Scotland to investigate their conduct.
OK, we shall see. And meanwhile, the Scottish Parliament has also been discussing a ban on dangerous Bully XL dogs. We know they're banned in England and Wales from the beginning of February unless owners get an exemption certificate. What's going to happen in Scotland?
Yes, that's right. So the UK government started the ball rolling in England and Wales back on New Year's Eve with some restrictions. And as you say, with that 1st of February deadline for those dogs, unless they have an exemption certificate. But that is not the case in Scotland yet. There has been a lot of debate about this, and the Conservatives were demanding answers in the Chamber on Tuesday from the Community Safety Minister.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will reconsider its position on further regulating the ownership of American XL bully dogs in Scotland, in light of reports that widespread rehoming from England to Scotland is raising public safety and animal welfare concerns.
The criminal law should provide clarity on whether an offence has been committed or not, and the unintended consequences of the UK government's policy is that we're now seeing an influx of XL bully dogs coming to Scotland. It is important to ensure Scotland does not become a safe haven or a dumping ground for the XL bully dogs from England and Wales. And I can confirm to Jamie Green and the Chamber that in light of recent events, ministers are urgently reviewing the policy on XL bully dogs, and public safety will be paramount in our deliberations, and a timetable for any policy change will be updated to Parliament imminently.
So can I ask the Minister, if XL bully dogs are being brought to Scotland, as Jamie Green has said, there's evidence of that, how will Scotland prevent this as long as it appears to be a safe haven? And is the answer not lie in being more aligned with England and Wales, not just to ensure that we can prevent this, but to ensure that we also comply with the welfare of dogs, who some are being destroyed on the back of this policy? Would it not make more sense to align with England and Wales?
I would say to any dog owner, they would need to understand if a possible ban does become introduced in Scotland. At this time, any purchase of an XL bully dog would be made within the context which may suggest it would be preferable not to acquire any such dog at the present time in Scotland.
So I think the direction of travel was clear there, and later in the week the First Minister did announce that he would be replicating the legislation in England and Wales, and further detail would be given next week, and the opposition called that a humiliating U-turn.
OK, and finally, something unique to Scotland, which, as you've explained, has got a separate legal system. Proposals to reform the law regarding sexual offences are proving controversial, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. So with this separate legal system, there is concern about how sexual offences are currently prosecuted in Scotland. Now, the Lord Advocate, whom we have heard about before, Dorothy Bain KC, has said that it just is not good enough. Now, a new Victims, Witnesses and Justice Reform Bill is being piloted through Holyrood at the moment. It will create a separate sexual offences court and will pilot judge-only rape trials. Now, the Lord Advocate herself was up before Holyrood's Justice Committee.
They are the most challenging, difficult cases that we prosecute. They concern us greatly. They're the thing that we talk about most. They're the issue that gives us the greatest cause for concern. There's not a single member of the prosecution service that I've met that joined the prosecution service in order to do these cases badly. Everybody wants to do them well and wants to do them to the best of their ability. I see the prosecution of these types of cases as of critical importance to the whole of the criminal justice system, and I would see no diminution at all being applied to the standard of prosecutor that would be taking these cases. If this sexual offence court was part of the High Court, it would be High Court prosecutors. As I've said previously, I consider this issue to be the challenge of our generation as prosecutors. We need to resolve these issues in and around sexual crime. They have a profound impact on the victims. They ruin lives. We've got to do something about it. We've got to have a better system.
So, Charlotte, we end where we started in a way with the Lord Advocate. The next time we see Dorothy Bain in this place, she could be appearing before MSPs to give them her evidence on the Post Office Horizon scandal. Back to you.
And we'll be bringing you the latest on Politics UK. All right, Andrew Kerr at Holyrood, thanks very much. Let's get back to Sean now in Westminster. Sean, we've seen storms and heavy rain in recent weeks, haven't we, which has led to flooding in many areas. And as MPs returned to Parliament this week, there were questions asked about whether the government could have been better prepared for that.
Yes, it was a very wet and miserable new year for hundreds of people. We had Storm Henk, and that saw very heavy rainfall in the first few days of January. And as you say, the first day back, the government made a statement about the flood prevention measures, and it did face some tough questions.
This was a severe weather incident. Storm Henk brought high winds with large amounts of rain across England last Wednesday. Met Office amber and yellow warnings were in place across the country, and this was followed by heavy rainfall on already saturated ground after a wetter than average autumn. Since 2010, the government has invested over £6 billion to better protect over 600,000 properties from flooding and coastal erosion. More than 75,000 properties have been protected as a result of the government's investment in flood defences over recent days.
Around 2,000 properties have been flooded to date, and much of the country remains underwater, yet the Prime Minister doesn't think it's serious enough to call a Cobra meeting. The government's failure to act effectively against the risk of floods has cost the economy billions of pounds since 2010. The government itself estimates losses at £1.3 billion a year on average. Just last October, the Environment Agency found that more than 4,000 English flood defences were rated poor or very poor, while the same agency was found to have underspent by £310 million of the budget that had been allocated it, money that should have been used to protect against flood damage. Labour has proposed a Cobra-style flood resilience task force to make sure communities are protected. It would meet every winter ahead of the peak season for flooding to coordinate flood preparation between central government and agencies and local authorities on the ground.
The government held a Cobra Unit Cabinet Office meeting last Tuesday to promote cross-sector preparedness action way in advance of Storm Henk taking place. And cross-government meetings chaired by DEFRA as the lead government department for flooding was held on many occasions last week and throughout this weekend.
The worry I have got, and I think many of us would have this, is that farmers are still systematically at the bottom of the priority list when it comes to tackling flood risk.
This weekend, we announced that farmers who have suffered uninsurable damage to their land will be able to apply for grants of up to £25,000 through the Farming Recovery Fund.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm sure that the Minister will sympathise with my constituents who have had their homes and their businesses flooded in the town of Tewkesbury, but also down the river at Sandhurst and Longford. It's been a desperate situation with road closures inconveniencing many people. Given that most of our problems tend to come from the fact that we are at the confluence of two main rivers, the Avon and the Severn, would the Minister have serious discussions with the Environment Agency about the potential benefits of river dredging? It's something that's talked about an awful lot, but I really do think it needs looking at very closely.
I want to be absolutely clear to the House of considering all options, whether it's dredging, whether it's looking at removing vegetation from our EA assets, because we must make sure that in addition to increasing the budget from £2.6 billion to £5.2 billion over the next financial period to better improve our flood resilience, that we are looking at all options to make sure that our farmers and those that face crop loss are basically being impacted positively as a result of some different measures.
Well, MPs there talking about the floods. Now, the new Foreign Secretary got a grilling from MPs this week, didn't he? Which wouldn't normally be unusual, except that Foreign Secretary is one former Prime Minister, David Cameron, who's in the Lords now.
Yes, I mean, he was the surprise appointment, I think, of Rishi Sunak's reshuffle back in November. And MPs had been waiting and looking for a way that they could question him. And there's still some discussion going on behind the scenes about is there a way that the procedures in the Commons could be changed so that MPs could question Lord Cameron, as he now is, regularly. But until they've sorted that out, the only way MPs can really cross-examine the Foreign Secretary is when he appears in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And this was his first appearance before the committee in his new role, so it was the first time he'd answered questions from MPs. And not surprisingly, I mean, he has got a lot of issues that he's been dealing with, but a lot of the focus was on the situation dealing with the conflict between Israel and Hamas.
Your appointment was lauded largely as the biggest political shock of the last year. What made you accept the role? Was it unfinished business?
No, it was just the chance to serve. I believe very profoundly in public service. I didn't expect to be called back to this role. I went to see the Prime Minister on I think it was a Monday or a Tuesday night, and we were talking about various problems, including Israel-Gaza, and then he suddenly said, well, I'm going to be having a reshuffle and I'd like you to be my Foreign Secretary. And that was quite a shock. Crucially, we've got to see a political horizon towards a two-state solution, because the way I see it is you won't get the sort of assistance on security, governance and technical help in Gaza after the conflict, unless you can convince Palestinian authorities, Palestinian people and Arab states that you've got a longer term horizon towards a two-state solution. What the Israelis are trying to do is they are trying to get rid of Hamas's ability to launch further attacks on Israel. I think you can do that. And one can disagree, and I would have differences with the way they've gone about it. I think if you take the argument there's nothing more that can be done militarily, you just have to freeze things where we are now, you've then got to make an argument, well, how do you get the remainder of Hamas out of Gaza, get rid of the rocket launchers? But I think the question you're asking now is what Israel's done, is that technically an occupation, and therefore do they have legal obligation? The point I would make is, look, whether or not they are de jure occupying, they are de facto occupying Gaza, and therefore when it comes to this issue of aid delivery, we need them to do more. At the moment we're at about 150 trucks a day getting into Gaza. We need to be closer to 500.
I represent a very large Jewish community, very large Muslim community. Both communities are both angry and fearful about what's happening in Israel and Gaza. Is there anything as Foreign Secretary you can do to help the tension that those communities are feeling?
I think one of the most important things with both communities, but perhaps particularly with British Muslims, is to demonstrate that we are an aid superpower that's doing what an aid superpower should be doing, and that is getting aid into Gaza. I think with the Jewish community, it's partly about demonstrating an understanding of just what a catastrophic event, what an appalling event the 7th of October was. I think sometimes people can forget, because of what's happened subsequently, just the scale. If you look at this country, the size of Israel, and to lose over 1,400 people in one day in those most horrific circumstances.
In your assessment as Foreign Secretary, has Israel at any point in its response breached international humanitarian law?
No, but if you're asking, am I worried that Israel has taken action that might be in breach of international law because this particular premises has been bombed or whatever? Yes, of course I'm worried about that, and that's why I consult the Foreign Office lawyers when giving this advice on arms exports.
Lord Cameron there, the Foreign Secretary. Thank you very much, Sean. We'll come back to you in just a little bit. But let's go over to Cardiff now and to our Wales political reporter, Larry Glyn Jones, who's at the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. Larry, the Welsh Government's 20 miles per hour restriction on traffic is continuing to cause controversy. What's the latest there?
Yes, absolutely. Still making waves here in Cardiff Bay. Since we last met on this programme, of course, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister, has announced that he's standing down. And the two candidates to succeed him, Vaughan Gething and Jeremy Miles, two current government ministers, have actually committed to review that policy or the implementation of it, although they insist that they do support the policy in principle. On top of that, this week marks the beginning of the enforcement period, which means the police can now fine those who are found to be breaking the speed limit. And these two things gave Andrew Davis, the leader of the opposition here, another excuse to bring it up in FMQs.
First Minister, yesterday you held a press conference that alluded to the fact that the 20 mph speed limit that the Welsh Government have brought forward was going to be looked at through the premise of gentle enforcement. In fact, I think the word that you used was if you were genuinely confused, you would not be prosecuted. But if you were confused, you would be prosecuted. What's the difference?
Well, the difference is, Chloe, that is not what I said. That's the first difference. So what I said was, where people are genuinely confused, then the system will seek to engage and to educate them. Where people claim to be confused, but there is no evidence that confusion lies at the root of their behaviour, then they cannot expect that enforcement action will not be taken.
Well, that's as clear as mud, isn't it, First Minister?
Now, this exchange got quite heated afterwards, with Mr Davis calling the policy once again a blanket 20-mile-an-hour limit. The Welsh Government insists that it's a default limit. And Mr Drakeford suggested that the leader of the Welsh Conservatives was peddling misinformation. But with this policy continuing to divide opinion here in Wales, it certainly won't be the last time we hear about it from the opposition, from the leader of the opposition, Andrew R.T. Davies. And they really do see this as a wedge issue ahead of the general election.
OK, and we've been hearing about debates on the post office scandal, both at Westminster and Holyrood. The lead campaigner, Alan Bates, is from Wales. What's been said in the Senedd?
Yes, there are many victims of the scandal here in Wales. Alan Bates, Noel Thomas and Lorraine Williams, to name just three who've been involved in the campaign. It was brought up as a topical question by Labour's Jack Sargent. And Trina Bjorweth, the leader of Plaid Cymru, asked about the Welsh Government's current contracts with Fujitsu, the company behind the Horizon software. Mr Bjorweth said he was aware that the Welsh Government had had dealings with the company, including a 5-year support and maintenance contract for Transport for Wales. He said there were now many questions for the Welsh Government to answer.
I am sickened by the scale of injustice of the Post Office Horizon scandal. So many lives impacted, so many lives ruined. It is truly a disgrace. People in authority complicit in this injustice, and many others unwilling to look and listen when campaigners like Alan Bates ask them to do so. The scales of justice in this country are tipped towards the powerful, and basic principles like a duty of candour are missing. This is why we need a UK government to introduce a Hillsborough law now.
What additional due diligence will be applied to the government's relationship with Fujitsu now and in the future as a result of the new public understanding of the scale of the scandal that Fujitsu was involved in? Are they fit to have contracts with Welsh Government? Is Welsh Government comfortable having contracts with a company at the heart of such a scandal?
Now, Hannah Blythen, the Deputy Minister for Social Partnerships, didn't have any of the answers to any of those questions. She said that she didn't have the details of the contracts at her fingertips, but did promise to bring that information to the Chamber as soon as possible.
OK, well, we'll wait for that. And finally, there's been a statement in the Senedd about a critical report into South Wales Fire and Rescue. What's the issue?
Yes, last week an independent review concluded that bosses at the South Wales Fire and Rescue Service tolerated sexual harassment and domestic abuse outside work. It led to the resignation of the Chief Fire Officer, Hugh Jakeway. The investigation was prompted by allegations of sexism and abusive behaviour towards staff. The report was absolutely damning and also found that favouritism and cronyism was a problem in the service. Hannah Blythen, I mentioned earlier, in a statement on Wednesday, said the matter was so serious that it wasn't a matter of if the Welsh Government intervened, but to what extent.
If senior management operates in an autocratic way, if promotion depends on who you know, not how good you are, and if behaviours such as fighting on duty or posting hateful and discriminatory comments online is punished only with a warning, then it is unsurprising that those who are motivated to misbehave think that they can get away with it. And sadly, it is also unsurprising that they did get away with it. When I met the chair of South Wales Fire and Rescue Authority yesterday, it was clear that he has taken the report seriously and accepts the recommendations in full. But that can only be the start of a long process of reform and cultural change. And I am far from convinced that the authority alone is capable of designing, overseeing and implementing that process. To be clear, the issue is not whether the Welsh Government becomes involved, but how and to what extent.
Now, this is a significant statement by Hannah Blythen, the Deputy Minister, because the Welsh Government has been criticised in the past for not intervening quickly enough in external bodies who've had issues with culture, namely the WRU, the Welsh Rugby Union. But in this instance, there's no doubt that their response has been swift and robust.
OK, to Larry Glyn Jones at Cardiff Bay, thanks so much for bringing us up to date. Let's go back to Westminster now, and a topic that lots of people watching might relate to, the difficulty of getting an NHS dentist and getting treatment. It was raised in the House of Commons this week. What was proposed?
Well, Labour called this debate. They wanted to talk about dental services in England, and they wanted to set out their policies for how they change the system. Now, the government has promised a dental recovery plan of its own, but this debate gave MPs the opportunity to talk about the situation in their area, and we got some very colourful examples, not least when one MP said that it was easier to get a ticket to Taylor Swift than it was to see an NHS dentist.
8 in 10 NHS dentists are no longer taking new patients. According to the NHS, no dentists are taking on new adult patients in entire constituencies like Broxtowe, Bolsover, Stoke-on-Trent South and Stroud. 5 million patients tried but failed to get an appointment in the past 2 years. Tooth decay is now the #1 reason children aged 6 to 10 end up in hospital. And we face the moral outrage of 1 in 10 Brits, 1 in 10, saying they have been forced to attempt dentistry themselves because the NHS wasn't there for them when they needed it. This is Dickensian, DIY dentistry in 21st century Britain. Labour's plan will deliver 700,000 more dental appointments a year for those most in need. New dentists recruited to dental deserts where there isn't a single dentist taking on new patients. Toothbrushing in primary school for 3 to 5-year-olds to promote good health and prevent demand on the NHS. And reform of the dental contract after 14 years of failure, so that once again, every patient who needs a dentist can get one.
The pandemic placed a long and heavy burden on NHS dentistry. And I hear the groans from opposite, but they cannot ignore the fact that some 7 million people did not come forward for appointments during that long period of the pandemic. Our long-term workforce plan, the first in NHS history, will expand dentistry training places by 40%, providing more than 1,100 places by 2031, which will be the highest level on record of any government. And of course, we must make sure that dentists are properly rewarded for all the work they do. And through our soon-to-be-published Dentistry Recovery Plan, we will go further to make NHS dentistry accessible and available for everyone who needs it, no matter where they call home.
I felt compelled to email to tell you we have a high number of children who are regularly missing out on education due to being unable to register with a local NHS dentist. A large number of our children have Polish, Romanian, Latvian and Ukrainian parents, and therefore will find it easier to travel back to their parents' original home country rather than wait for a local NHS dentist who is accepting patients. Wow. Let's be clear what she is saying. There are some children in Cumbria who find it easier to get dental treatment travelling to a war zone than to access NHS dental care that their parents have already paid for through their taxes.
The 700,000 urgent appointments a year that the opposition talk about, I mean, the reason I can't support the amendment is because I hear no detail as to how. I hear no detail particularly as to who these dentists are that are going to fulfil all of these appointments, and I certainly hear no explanation as to when.
That was MPs there discussing NHS dentistry. Thank you so much for taking us through the week in Westminster, Sean. That's all we've got time for on Politics UK this week. Politics Live will be back on Monday at 12:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. In the meantime, have a great weekend.